Hello, and greetings to my peers, among others. I hope your day treats you well. First off, may I say that what we consider as education is likely due to societal connotations from established institutions, including laws, and what one may describe as internalized normativity, which is to imply that education is an official rite of passage into economic upward mobility in today's age. Craft, on the other hand, had largely based itself on the apprenticeship model of education, whereby before the rise of our current and modern commodity production system based largely, for the most part, on exchange, the middle-aged craft production system based trade more on the usefulness or utility of the products being exchanged. Though there was in fact a profit motive, like the one which determines our educational system to this day, education in the Middle Ages appears to have been intended for the preservation and propagation of religious knowledge, especially the authority of the Christian Church within a Eurocentric framework, and despite the other ongoing civilizations at that time period to which we refer as the so-called Middle Ages. Mainly the difference between then and now has been the difference of scale, in my eyes, to the degree in which linguistic technology has advanced capital accumulation, which is to say, the material wealth depositories of commodities within home life as well as society at large, within the metropoles of civilization and our resultant satellite states and integrated settler societies. And as such, in my opinion, this day's educational dynamics has in fact intensified our societal divisions based on one, the present status quo, such as the so-called school-to-prison complex within a de facto Jim Crow, according to the postmodern liberal. Two, advanced militarization technology of the state reinforcing itself against any group challenging the dynamics of civilized class power, such as the anti-intellectual subcultures, and those who view themselves as having no prospect for economic growth, currently residing in the third world. And three, the increasing mechanization of religious and philosophical paradigms since the supersession of the late Middle Ages into the Renaissance and beyond from the perspective of an earthly spirit into advanced design capabilities enabled by the cultural flourishing intended to be preserved within libraries according to the increased valuing of historical context. To my knowledge, primarily since the ancient Greek philosophers first transliterated oral communication by converting linguistic cultural transference of knowledge from the repetition of the widespread intergenerational oral transmission of cultural knowledge via the works of poets such as Homer, to the development of the Socratic dialogue, into the written word after the Greek colonization of Hebrew and its conversion into written Greek as a precursor to Latin, characterized by freethinkers such as David Abram as an entrenchment of continually replacing natural alienation into societal abstraction foundational of the abstract thoughts demanded of the higher society, especially in the development of advanced post-linguistic technology and the human use of humans, as would be first detailed and promoted by Machiavellian forms of thought, and veins throughout historical manifestation and expression and social recovery after the Middle Ages. The Renaissance, I would assert, is that period of time which links the passage between the present day and age and the Middle Ages, because it was the first growing division between contemporary mechanistic reductionist thought patterns, increasing in fragmentation as the parts of a machine, as imagined by visionaries such as Ray Bradbury and Kurt Vonnegut, compared to the banal assertions of biblical texts being the foundation of advanced educational access, beyond what in my day we called shop math, for logging basic measurements and transactions. I see education as part of any norm internalization, regardless of the gatekeeper assertions of any socio-economic rite of passage, alike to our universities in this society, against more scathingly primitive forms of education like peer-to-peer horizontal transmissions of mimetic macro-imaging, as a form of seeding our cultural values, irrespective of any purportedly official memory or historical narrative of the state. Whereas today, education within the cybernetic human social engagement has largely self-initialized itself beneath and outside of particular dogmatic propagations. The intergenerational educational mimetics of the past were left to the organization akin to the caste system maintained by the authority of the church. Because, after all, my basic premise is that ideology is the artificial eyes of the authorities, whereby state control is reinforced by church promulgations ever since the Council of Nicaea to this day. The highlighted difference considered by me as an increased secularization, breaking down these vertical divisions while shifting the tiers of economic hierarchy into an increasingly sanitized brutalization of those denied access, from a largely serf-based exclusion, with the guilt power in between, to circumstances and tight choices detracting from one's capacity to accumulate wealth, regardless of whether it be in the form of money or actual physical products themselves, and the revision of the debt economy from land-bearing peasants to a general service sector, or broadly tertiary economy within the metropoles of civilization, as the mechanistic reductionist paradigms which skyrocketed the Renaissance's cultural dominion and psychological acuity have become increasingly more entrenched, and deeply at the point as everything had already been defined, and there was nowhere at that point to go beyond the theories of what is ostensibly termed romanticism, within a cultural perspective as relating to being specifically defined by educational establishments, that is to say, a precursor to education today. Whereas debt had been an attribute of the lowest classes, living a hand-to-mouth existence, according to the glorious feudal lord's gracious and most generous kind heart, in the here and now, debt is a resultant factor precisely of this rite of passage of education. Despite the debt of the poor today would live a paycheck to paycheck existence rather than a more debt-based existence on the educational and post-educational classes, especially in the Trumpian era of post-Obama. And though it is beyond the scope of my capabilities for this paper, I must state that in my opinion, educational mobility on a widespread scale is largely a myth, even in the sense of the Greek myth as the basis for cultural transmission. Because the myths determine our cultural trajectories as we move along these vectors, living out our everyday lives out of predetermined circumstances. Power, in fact, needs myth for social stability, whether it had been the head-lowering peasant in the town square or at the king's court on trial, or today's urban poor asking for a spare cigarette because they couldn't pay attention in school due to the home's economic circumstances, or inner-city war on drugs escalations, or for whatever reason, really. My main conclusion, based on general knowledge, would be to ask you to appreciate the fact that society is continually becoming better and requiring less and less slavery to maintain the present status quo, as the globalists automize economic functions, giving us more leisure time than the peasants would have had, as liberals might today call them crop steward technicians, in the politically correct language essential today in this era. If anything, peasants were less aware of their historical roles, unlike the modern poor, who despite their assumed educational errors, are all forced to go into school, despite whether or not they have been able to demonstrate the real retention of information. If anything, everyone is starting off on a better foot in the civilizational metropoles, being that they are not deep in Africa, mining minerals for electronics just out of walking age in exchange for unfathomably low amounts of wage. I don't want to proposition the notion of corporate feudalism in the third world without the proper intellectual backings for my arguments. It is mostly a question of who in the metropoles is to blame for the educational failings of the middle lower to lower classes under the elite rulers and skilled laborers with the time to run multinational corporations, whether it be the liberal solution of blaming the consumer for economic faults, or the failure of the benevolent parent state in empowering the lower classes to be proper citizens who do, as is known, ask not what they can do for their country. Most of the urban poor people just can't handle the constant challenges being thrown at them from every direction on the school grounds, in the office, or at the shop and factory floor, which is to say, they can't balance themselves out between these challenging circumstances of disparate privation versus the education which they not just want, yet I know they in fact need, so they aren't killing themselves half to death, working 2 to 3 part-time jobs to feed their family and their children. This has been a historical failure in that most people cannot or will not accept the debts required as a sacrifice for higher education, thereby shorten their life prospects and having an increasing so-called freedom, what I call autonomy. The positive compared to the past is that historical literacy is increasing despite the aforementioned linguistic fragmentations and inconsistencies, even if it is the official interpretation of the Greek scholars. It will be greatly interesting to see how the next waves of technology, such as the increasingly computerized social world and the developments of 5G network speeds and inbuilt towers, will affect education as it impacts psychological development now that it is being tested in certain parts of the world. I believe that it will be our Renaissance, just like the post-medieval historical period before us. Take care, everyone, and have a very nice day. This is History Matters. History matters, and I appreciate whomever took the time out of their days to hear this properly.